Good evening, everybody. We're just going to give folks a couple more minutes to join us here, and then we'll get started tonight. All right, well, welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. My name is Robin Rush, and I'm an engagement and education specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks, and I'll be facilitating this evening's session, Shared Harvest, Alberta's Approach to the Sustainable Allocation of Hunting Opportunity. So to start us off here this evening, I just wanted to take a moment in the spirit of reciprocity and truth to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from traditional territory of Treaty 7. And as we're coming together online this evening, chances are that we're dispersed across the traditional territories and homelands of many Indigenous people. So I'd like to acknowledge all the treaties in the province, as all of Alberta is treaty land. I'd also like to acknowledge the long history and deep connections of the First Nations and Métis with this land, and honor this tonight in hopes of connection and continuing to work together in a good way. So tonight, we're going to go through a couple of housekeeping items before we move into our presentation all about Alberta's approach to the sustainable allocation of hunting opportunity. Then we'll take a couple of moments to introduce you to the subject matter experts on our panel this evening before moving into our question and answer session. We are scheduled to run through to 8:30 tonight, so we'll have plenty of time and do our best to answer as many of your questions as possible here. So for our Q&A, we will be using the tool in Zoom. So if you're joining tonight from a computer, you should see that Q&A button along the bottom of your screen in the Zoom toolbar. But if you're joining from a mobile phone or a tablet, that toolbar might actually be located along the left-hand side or the top of your screen. So you can go ahead and click on that button to open up the tool. And once you do, a question box, just like this one here, will appear on your screen. And you'll be able to type out any of your questions there. So once you post a question, it will be seen by others on the line tonight. And if you notice that somebody else has asked the same question that you have about allocation of recreational and commercial hunting opportunity, or that somebody has asked a question you'd really like to hear a response to, you can use the upvoting tool by clicking that thumbs up icon beneath the question. And upvoted questions will help us to prioritize the questions that we're answering this evening and the order that they are answered in. Now, we do have a couple of ground rules here tonight. So if we have already answered questions that are being asked again, we will dismiss them in order to answer as many questions as possible during our session. And we'll be combining similar questions or questions along the same lines or topic to provide a more holistic response to the group of them together. Now, last but not least, anything inappropriate will be deleted. So let's try to keep it clean, although I'm sure that won't be a problem for us this evening. I know many of you have already also submitted questions or topics that you're interested in learning more about through the recent engagement survey on wildlife management and the vision for recreational hunting. So some of those questions were actually used to plan tonight's presentation and will be answered shortly. We also have a second session planned for December 14th, so next Tuesday night. And I do want to take this moment to invite all of you to register for that one as well, where our subject matter experts will be speaking to the science behind your hunting license and how recreational hunting opportunities are allocated in Alberta. So as you can see, we do have a panel of Fish and Wildlife Stewardship staff online tonight, and we'll put some names to the faces you see on screen after our presentation and before we move into the question and answer period. But for the time being, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Kim Morton. And Kim is a manager of Provincial Wildlife Policy, with Alberta Environment and Parks. And so now I'm going to pass things over to Kim to take us through our presentation.
Kim, I think you're on mute there. If you just want to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Welcome to tonight's webinar, everybody, and thanks for joining us. And thanks, Robin, for getting everything set up and introducing the webinar for tonight. So Robin's provided you my work title, but I also wanted to add that I'm an active consumptive user as well. And every fall, I look forward to getting out and hunting with family and friends here in Alberta. So tonight, we're going to be looking at what the term big game allocation means and the principles that guide how Fish and Wildlife Stewardship Division allocates big game resources to provide sustainable hunting opportunities. For tonight's session, there are going to be 3 objectives. The first objective is to build trust and foster collaborative relationships with stakeholders. Over the years, Fish and Wildlife has engaged with a variety of stakeholders in a variety of ways to inform big game management decisions. At the policy level, various advisory committees have been established to support such things as policy development, to review proposed regulation amendments, and to provide recommendations in the development of management objectives. This evening's webinar is an opportunity to engage with the broader public who may not always feel represented by the established formal stakeholder groups. The second objective for tonight's session is to increase participants' understanding of the how and why big game resources are allocated. Results from the recent public engagement on the vision for recreational hunting in Alberta indicated that the allocation of the provincial big game resources was of primary interest to survey respondents. Tonight's webinar is the first in our commitment to respond to what we heard during that engagement. The final objective for tonight is to start an open conversation on hunting in Alberta with tonight's discussion on the process of big game allocation. We hope that the information provided tonight is of value to you and will generate some good questions and discussion from our panel members. In Alberta, we have several big game species that provide sustainable consumptive use opportunities to both Albertans and non-residents. This webinar is the first in a series meant to inform the public on how and why we allocate big game hunting opportunities the way that we do. Tonight, we'll focus at the provincial scale on the principles behind allocation, the various types and opportunities of big game allocations, and how that opportunity is distributed, again, at the provincial scale. So what does the term allocation mean when used by Fish and Wildlife? We are typically referring to the proportion of the big game populations that are allocated for recreational and commercial hunting. However, what does the term allocation mean when used by the public? It may mean different things depending on the scale that you're looking at. At the scale of the individual hunter, allocation may refer to how often someone is successful in being drawn for a particular species and how many other hunters they're going to run into while out hunting that year. If we look at the scale of the Wildlife Management Unit, or WMU, allocation refers to how many hunting opportunities are available by species and to whom they've been allocated. For example, in WMU 108 down in southern Alberta, for the 2021 hunting season, antlered mule deer opportunity was allocated as outlined in the table that you see. If we zoom out to the scale of the provincial level, allocation refers to the summary of overall opportunity within the province and how it's been allocated. Again, using antlered mule deer, we see how the total opportunity for the 2021 hunting season was allocated. So how do we make allocation decisions for big game here in Alberta? The allocation process is driven by the best available knowledge, guided by scientific principles, and an acknowledgement of the variety and often competing stakeholder objectives. Within that context, allocation follows these priorities. Our first and foremost priority with any species, including big game, is the sustainability of provincial populations. We strive to manage wildlife through the lens of conservation for healthy populations that are then able to support our other allocation priorities. To achieve this, we inventory populations regularly to establish status and trends and use current population estimates to determine the harvestable surplus, if any, that may be then available for allocation. Our second priority is acknowledging and respecting Indigenous harvest rights. Across Canada, Indigenous persons have constitutional rights to harvest wildlife for both subsistence and ceremonial purposes. These rights to harvest are not restricted by quotas. For tonight's webinar, we'll be focusing on the allocation of the harvestable surplus that provides recreational and commercial hunting opportunities. And just for clarification, commercial hunting opportunities refer to allocations that are made available to the outfitted hunting industry. So now let's look at the underlying principles that are applied at the provincial scale in our allocation process. Principle number one is that big game are a shared resource. As one of its 7 foundational principles, the North American model for wildlife conservation identifies wildlife, as a public trust to be managed by governments for the benefits of all. Simply put, provincial big game resources belong to all Albertans. While Fish and Wildlife has legally delegated the responsibility to manage wildlife for the benefit of current and future Albertans, we do so under social license provided by you, the owners of the resource. As such, engaging with you is critical to maintain that social license to manage on your behalf. Our second principle is that hunting is a right for Albertans. In 2008, the Hunting, Fishing, and Trapping Heritage Act was passed. It recognizes the important role that these activities continue to play in shaping Alberta's social, cultural, and economic heritage, and the need for these traditions to be valued by future generations. It also acknowledges the important contributions that those activities have in the understanding, conservation, restoration, and management of our provincial fish and wildlife resources. The third principle is that hunting opportunities align with current species management objectives. Species management plans for big game outline the desired objectives for the species and strategies to achieve them. Management objectives will vary between species and areas of the province, depending on various biological and social considerations. They will also vary by user group, which can result in trying to balance competing interests. For example, in areas of high conflict with agricultural producers, landowners may want to see reduced numbers, while hunters may want to see more animals for increased hunting opportunity. Many of our management plans are old and may not accurately reflect today's pressures and the current interests of user groups. We are currently in the process of updating them, with several being completed, such as the Wild Turkey Plan, which was just out for public engagement recently. We are currently working with stakeholder groups to update both the mule deer and the bighorn sheep management plans. As each of these plans is updated and a final draft is developed, we will again be looking to engage with the public, providing an opportunity to review and provide input to help us to ensure that management objectives are reflective of both public desire and that appropriate strategies are developed and implemented. The fourth principle is that the province supports a viable outfitted hunting industry. Alberta is renowned for its diversity and abundance of big game hunting opportunities. The outfitted hunting industry provides important economic benefits, as well as highlights Alberta as a valued tourist destination for both hunting and non-hunting related activities. When we look at the portion of the population that is identified for allocation, the small green slice of the pie, commercial outfitting makes up only a small sliver of the overall allocated hunting opportunity. So those are the underlying principles in the allocation process. So now let's look at the opportunities that are available to us through the allocation of that harvestable surplus. There are many combinations of hunting seasons and license types. This evening, we will only be discussing seasons and license types at the provincial scale and in general terms. If you're interested in more detail on the various seasons and hunting licenses that may be available to you, I would encourage you to use the My Wild Alberta site, where you can find the current Alberta Guide to Hunting Regulations and the Alberta Hunting Draw booklet, both of which can provide you more detail on seasons and license types. The first season type is the archery only season. It's usually the first season in the fall hunting season and can start as early as August 25th and run as late as November 30th, but typically occurs in the months of September and October. Hunting during this season requires a bow hunting permit, as well as an applicable big game license. Hunters are restricted to only authorized bow and arrow as a weapon during this season, and not all species have a separate archery only season. The next season is the general season, or as it's often commonly referred to, the rifle season. Timing and length can vary widely depending on species and area of the province. For example, our pronghorn seasons are 3-day for non-trophy and 6-day for trophy. At the other end of the scale, some of our antlerless elk seasons may extend, may extend out over 2 to 3 months, often running into late January. The general season includes a variety of license types, including general licenses, special licenses, and landowner licenses. Hunters are allowed to use any weapon authorized to hunt big game that include rifle, muzzleloader, shotgun, crossbow, and archery equipment. However, there may be some exceptions to this in some WMUs around major urban centers such as Calgary and Edmonton, where there may be restrictions to primitive weapons only. And finally, we have special seasons. These are seasons with a specific management objective, which is typically population reduction. And these are typically limited to a very localized area. An example of a special season is the McGrath quota hunt that occurs occasionally during midwinter. The special season is designed to reduce a targeted, substantial white-tailed deer population that resides in and around the community of McGrath in southern Alberta. As I mentioned earlier, there are a wide variety of licenses available, many with different eligibility requirements, including age, such as our youth and seniors licenses, and residency. Non-resident Canadians are eligible to hold certain licenses in Alberta. Generally, though, licenses can be categorized under the following types. The general license is a license that's available over the counter, no quotas, and it provides opportunity for a specific species over a wide geographic area. Typically, general licenses are only used for species where unrestricted harvest is sustainable and won't negatively affect provincial populations. General licenses allow for maximum opportunity and provide Albertans with a guaranteed opportunity to hunt each year. Last year, over 100,000 general whitetail licenses were sold. The next license type is special licenses. Special licenses or limited entry hunts are available through our provincial draw system. Special licenses are used to allocate species that are vulnerable to overharvest or where specific management objectives may require restrictions on the number of animals harvested. Special licenses are for specific species and for a specific geographical area, typically a single wildlife management unit. The next type of license are landowner licenses, which we have had around for over 25 years. Landowner licenses were originally created to acknowledge stewardship provided by landowners that benefited wildlife, to provide a tool for landowners to address agricultural conflict with certain species, and as a means to encourage landowners to continue to provide hunting access. Landowners unsuccessful in the draws may be eligible to purchase a landowner license, which would allow them harvest only on their own land, their private land that is under their title. And only mule deer and antlerless elk special licenses are available under a landowner license. The final license type is a partner license. Partner licenses allow for the sharing of not just the hunting opportunity, but also of the harvest opportunity. A partner license authorizes an eligible hunter to hunt with another hunter who was successful in the draw and holds a special license. Between the two hunters, they can only still harvest one animal. As I mentioned previously, commercial hunting opportunities are authorized under outfitter allocations. The Alberta Professional Outfitter Society is formally designated as a delegated authority of the Minister of Environment and Parks through the wildlife regulations. Under that authority, APOS is responsible for the designation of guides and the distribution of outfitter allocations to its members. These allocations are available for non-resident and non-resident aliens only, non-resident aliens being non-residents of Alberta that live outside of Canada. However, over the last 2 years, concessions were made to allow residents to utilize outfitter allocations. This was done due to the impacts on the outfit hunting industry caused by border restrictions that prevented many non-residents from coming into Alberta to hunt. Outfitter allocations are determined on a 5-year term. This facilitates business planning for the outfitters. These 5-year terms are renewed based on a review of current population trends and resident allocations. There are many opportunities for us to hunt a variety of big game species, often multiple species within a given year. So now we'll take a look at how that opportunity is distributed amongst the different stakeholders at the provincial scale. As a reminder, we're only talking about the harvestable surplus that is available for recreational and commercial hunting opportunity, a small portion of the overall population. Recreational allocation receives the majority of the distribution and includes all available recreational license types, including landowner licenses. The commercial allocation varies by species and geographic location, but it's typically less than 10% for most big game species and approximately 20% for bighorn sheep, cougar, and black bear, all species which are hunted on a general license. As part of the government's commitment to transparency in wildlife management, we are looking for ways to make information more readily available to the public in a format that is easy to read and is easy to understand. My Wild Alberta is one of our key websites where we share information publicly. Recently, our department compiled big game allocation summaries for the 2021 season by species and WMU. For specific WMUs or species that you may be interested in, please visit My Wild Alberta to view these allocation summaries. When we consider the 2021 hunting season, Alberta's big game populations support significant recreational hunting opportunity. This year, over 267,000 hunting opportunities were available to recreational and commercial hunting. Now, I just want to point out, it's important to remember that each allocation doesn't represent a harvested animal. Harvest success varies by species and by location. For some species, harvest success can be very low, but overall, the annual estimated harvest is approximately 1/3 of the overall opportunity. So that concludes the presentation. Thanks for your time this evening, and I'll turn it back over to Robin now to take us into the question and answer.
All right, thank you so much, Kim. And thank you to everybody on the line for following along this evening. We hope that you found Kim's presentation informative. So now we're going to move into the question and answer portion of the evening. So just a reminder, if you haven't already, now is a great time to open up that Q&A tool from your Zoom control panel and start typing in any questions you might have about the allocation of recreational and commercial hunting opportunities here in Alberta. And don't forget to use that thumbs up icon to upvote questions you'd like to hear the answers to. And as I mentioned before, this is really helpful for us to prioritize questions to answer tonight. We have quite a big group, so we're going to answer as many questions as we can between now and 8:30. So while you're opening up that Q&A tool and starting to type in your questions, I'm going to take a moment here to introduce you to our panelists. So on the panel tonight, we have Rob Corrigan, who is a provincial game specialist, Brian Joubert, manager of licensing, Dave Kay, our commercial wildlife specialist, Kim Morton, who you've all already met, manager of provincial wildlife policy, Travis Ripley, executive director of Fish and Wildlife Stewardship, and Curtis Stamba, wildlife manager in northwestern Alberta. Now, also online tonight, we have Janine Higgins and Dave Mussel, who are engagement and education specialists working on technical support behind the scenes. And you've met me already, but again, my name is Robin, and I'll be facilitating this evening's question and answer session. And I see we have quite a few questions coming in already, so let's jump right into it. Our first question here comes from Perry tonight. And Perry's asking, it used to be that if a person shot a CWD or chronic wasting disease infected deer, they'd receive a new tag for the next year. That has changed. Can you please explain why?
Hi, Perry. Thanks for the question. When our CWD program first started, our prevalence was quite low, and we could offer those replacement tags to hunters that did harvest an infected deer. As our prevalence rates increased and the number of deer that we were getting that came back infected, if we were to continue offering those licenses to hunters the following year and subsequent years, our quotas that would be available for our special license draws would have to be lowered by quite a bit. So it just had to do with our prevalence increasing and the number of positive deer that we were picking up in our surveillance programs. And it was just would have limited the number of licenses that were available for our special license draws.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. So our next question is from Dawn, and Dawn's asking, why are outfitter allocations not limited by WMU to 10% or less? For example, in WMUs 434, 430, and 432, resident antlered moose allocations are 5 per year. At 10%, commercial allocations would be 0 or 0.5 per year.
Thanks, Don, for that question. So our policy is to allocate up to 10% of the harvest of antlered big game to the outfitted hunting industry. And so when that actually equates down to the number of allocations available, it really relates to harvest success. And so some of those areas, like the 400 zones where harvest success is low, the actual opportunity allowed to harvest those animals can be greater. And that's what you're seeing with those 400 zones. We don't manage that at the WMU level. We manage at the species management area level. And so that level of allocation would still result in about 10% of the actual harvest in those zones. So thank you.
Perfect, thanks for that, Dave. So our next question is from Brett, and Brett's asking, why are we still protecting yearling bull elk less than 3 point in WMUs where we are shooting all other ages and sex classes of elk?
Hi, thanks for the question, Brett. In most WMUs where we have that restriction for 3 point or better, the objective is to allow for a substantial harvest of elk. We're not particularly trying to grow the elk herds in those areas. They're typically in areas where there could be potential for problems with agricultural depredation. And by allowing to the harvest of 3 point or better, during the rifle season, it usually occurs after the rut, and the breeding has been done for the most part. So we're still finding that we have enough recruitment the following spring to maintain somewhat of an elk herd, but allowing that harvest of 3-point or better is for providing that, a maximum hunting opportunity for bull elk while maintaining a sustainable herd on the landscape. And it really comes down to sort of hunter preference, and that's what hunters have traditionally told us, that they'd like to be able to harvest those bulls that are 3-point or better and maintain elk on the landscape. So
Great, thanks so much for that, Rob. So our next question here tonight is from Brad. And Brad says, just curious how Alberta can get an accurate management objective for the next hunting season when the big game harvested by Indigenous and now also Métis over the previous year have no requirement to submit the numbers of big game they have harvested.
Yeah, so thanks, Robin. I could probably take this one. So if I understand this question correct, it's how we account for some of the constitutional harvest that happens every year. And we recognize that, First Nations and Métis harvesters harvest animals, and how do we account for that? So in general, it varies by species and by WMU, but essentially we account for that harvest similar to how we would for any other natural mortality that would occur. So annually we create or we generate pre-season population estimates, and that is a function of our ungulate aerial surveys that we do every number of years. But every year we have to come up with a pre-season population estimate, and we factor in some of that, similar to how we would do natural mortality in a WMU. The one thing to bear in mind here is that the aerial ungulate survey program is fundamental in creating our allocations and our population estimates. So every time we do that, it is a recalibration of how we allocate annually. So there's going to be more of this actually in our next webinar. So maybe keep that as a precursor to the next webinar next week.
Great, thank you, Curtis. All right, our next question is from Dave tonight. And Dave's asking, when a person purchases a partner tag, why is it a requirement that the remain tag holder be there with that person who holds the partner tag? If the proximity rule is in place to avoid 2 animals being taken with the partner tag, then the person not being out hunting at all would certainly guarantee that would not happen.
So our partner license program is intended to provide opportunities for people to share that experience together. And if we were to allow people to get a license and then assign a partner and then not hunt with them, that really is sort of counter to what the program was designed to do. It's designed to bring in friends and relatives and hunt with them and share that experience. And by allowing 2 people to share that license out there together, that's the intent of the program. It's not to draw one license and then let people take alternating days to go and try to get that animal. It's to share that experience. So that was the intent of the program, and that's why we have that regulation in place that they have to be in close contact and in to each other's to share that experience.
Perfect, thanks so much for that, Rob. Our next question is from Amir. So why is cattle grazing on public land in Southwest Alberta not managed to ensure there is enough feed left for wildlife such as elk?
Okay, it's a little bit out of scope of tonight's webinar, but I'll take a stab at that. Public lands looks after managing all of the grazing on Crown land within the province, including down in the southwest part of the province. And the grazing land and the public lands in that area is managed for multiple objectives. The primary one being grazing, but part of that grazing is to maintain enough forage for the wildlife species as well. And for the most part, I think it's there. We've got populations of wildlife that are doing okay in a lot of those areas.
Thanks, Kim. So our next question is from Dave. Do rights-based harvesters require firearm discharge permits to hunt inside provincial parks? And do their rights supersede potential conflicts with other users inside parks?
Well, thank you, Dave. I can take that question. It's a very good question. Not a licensing function we do, but I have worked on that program with parks, and that's under their regulations. But the first part of your question is yes, Indigenous harvesters are required to have firearms discharge permits where other hunters are required. For example, Cooking Lake Blackfoot. Those permits are issued differently to recreational hunters. They tend to be issued for longer periods of time, 6 months at a time. And under regulations, there are some limits that can be imposed, such as not hunting on Sundays, for example, but no seasonality, no bag limits. Those are all rights that are maintained under those permits. Oh, my lights just died in my building. But the second part of your question about superseding conflicts, that's really just a site-based management issue, and I'm not aware of any that have really arisen. The priority being accommodating those Indigenous rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. All right, next up is a question from Joe. Why are Indigenous people allowed to use rifles in archery zones and during archery seasons?
Okay, under their constitutional harvest rights, there are no seasons set for Indigenous harvesters, and there's no restrictions on weapons or anything that can be used during what we would typically have as our recreational hunting season. So they're not regulated in that manner. How they exercise their rights is not determined by law. So they can be using a rifle season out when we might have an archery only season going on in the province.
Perfect, thanks, Kim. And what portion of the whole allocation goes to, or does Indigenous Harvest account for?
Okay, as was sort of discussed before, we don't, I guess, track or have a harvest survey for Indigenous harvesters. We don't track it in any way, but I think Curtis touched on already how we allocate for that when we're looking at assessing our populations for status and trends in the populations during our inventory process, and that's how it's taken into consideration. So we don't have an idea of what the proportion of the whole allocation Aboriginal harvest is, because we don't manage it or track it in any way.
Okay, thanks for that, Kim. Paul is asking what portion of the whole, or sorry, that's the one we just did. David is asking, has there ever been consideration of extending archery moose season by a week to give bow hunters an opportunity to hunt during the peak of the rut, rather than ending the season when the rut is just beginning?
Hi, thanks for the question. And a lot of our moose hunting seasons are sort of steeped in tradition, and in the boreal forest and in the foothills, that rut season sort of always been aligned with the rifle season. That's it's a tradition, and we do have a lot of archery seasons in the prairies and parkland where the rut the archery season is on during the peak of the rut. The question probably is asking why, or have we considered in those rifle seasons in the boreal and the foothills, and not so much the parklands. And I would say it's just a tradition that we've had. And if we take a week away from the rifle season and put it into the archery season, that's opportunity for archers, but it's a diminished opportunity for rifle hunters. So to do something like that would take considerable consultation with our stakeholders, and it's it's a tough thing, because that moose rut is pretty special to a lot of rifle hunters, and they don't want to lose that opportunity. So that's just the way that it, it was designed, and that's the way that it is, I guess.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Our next question is from Josh. Josh said, it seems that chronic wasting disease is spreading quickly. What is the anticipated 10, 20, and 50-year outlook and projection?
Hi, thanks, Josh. It's Travis here. That's a good question, and it is a little bit speculative. The long-term impacts of CWD are not fully well known. We do know that the disease is slowly spreading westward and a bit northward, and our teams continue to monitor the spread of CWD and also calculate the prevalence. We do anticipate it will increase, but we are also working on alternatives such as vaccines research and other types of options to look at how we might control the disease going forward. So I know it's very speculative, and 20, 50 years down the road is a long ways to look out, but we're hopeful as a province and with some of our research partners and conservation groups, we can start to curtail the disease and keep it within a certain range, maybe even reduce it if possible. Thanks for the question.
Excellent, and thanks for that answer, Travis. Next up is a question from Mike, who's a new hunter, and he's asking, why is mule deer special draw and whitetail mostly open?
Hi, thanks for that question, Mike. The primary reason, or the main reason, has to do with the susceptibility of mule deer to rifle harvest. If mule deer are open to a general rifle harvest, they're a lot more likely to for hunters to be successful than whitetails. It's a fairly mule deer can be a lot easier to hunt than whitetails, and the whitetail populations can withstand a general harvest for the most part, whereas mule deer, that's likely not the case in a lot of areas. So we're more careful with our management of mule deer, and by putting them on special license to control the number of people that are actively hunting them. And it's just the difference in the species of deer, and typically how the ease in which they can be hunted versus whitetails. So that's the main reason.
Thanks, Rob. Next up is a question from Anthony, who's asking, there are certain grazing leases that have roads running through them, maintained by one or more oil companies. The grazing lease owners have convinced the oil companies to lock the gates, which does limit access to the public. Can they do this? And is there a way we can challenge the locking of the gates in order to allow the general public access?
Okay, again, this is a bit out of scope for Fish and Wildlife, as the dispositions, oil and gas, grazing are all administered by Lands as the regulatory body on that. So it would depend on what conditions are in place on the road disposition, perhaps. The actual locked gate might actually be a requirement for safety reasons or for various reasons put in place by Lands. In any situation, if a member of the public is out on Crown land recreating, whether it's hunting or anything else, if at any time you feel that you've been denied access for some reason, your course of action should be to contact the local land settlement officer or the local agrologist who's administering grazing leases, and they'd be able to answer any questions or confirm if there are any conditions in place requiring that gate to be locked. And if there aren't, then that's how you would pursue getting access.
Thanks, Kim. So Taryn is asking, shouldn't landowners holding landowner tags be obligated to grant access to their land? If they're aiming at controlling population, they should be allowing access to all hunters.
Okay, I'll take a stab at answering that one. So landowners can allow access or restrict access for a large number of reasons on private land, and that's completely up to the landowner. Us having landowner licenses available, one of the things that we're hoping to do is to encourage landowners to provide access, but they're not obligated to. And in some cases, we're going to find situations where that doesn't work, and we're not seeing increased access. Again, when we are talking to landowners, if landowners come to us talking about complaining about high numbers or depredation, elk, mule deer, whatever it might be, getting into their crops, that's one of the things that we always talk to them about is the need to allow hunting access on their land. So we do work from that aspect as well. But with respect to having it as a condition of their landowner license, we don't have those conditions in place because we can't force anybody to allow someone onto their private land for hunting.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kim. So Rod is asking, when was the last 5-year allocation review completed?
For the question, Rod, and it's good to see you tonight. I think when you mentioned your question about the 5-year allocation review, you're talking about the commercial hunting, the APOS allocation review that we normally do on a 5-year period. So it's a good question. In fact, we're behind on that allocation review. The last one done was over 5 years ago, and we haven't recalculated some of the allocations at this point in time because there's been a lot of activity happening within the commercial hunting industry in Alberta. As you know, they've suffered some severe hardships with the border closed to the United States and the lack of clients being able to access opportunities here in Alberta. So part of the plan going forward, and we've been in good conversation and contact with a number of the board members of Alberta Professional Outfitter Society, is to restart that process and re-kick that process off coming up in the next little while. I'm not sure exactly the timing on that, Rod, but it will be something that's coming up soon for sure. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you, Travis. So Brad is asking, will the outfitter allocation tags increase in 2021 for COVID losses from 2022 be reduced back to pre-COVID tag numbers this upcoming fall?
Yeah, thanks. So yes, I mean, that's the intent. Consideration, as Travis just said, considerations were given to the outfitted hunting industry because of the inability for clients to cross borders because of the COVID situation, and they were definitely made on a temporary basis, and they will expire once that kind of stability resumes with their industry. So, we've got to look at what occurs with this new variant and what kind of border restrictions may continue to be in place or not. But certainly the intent is to return those allocations back to pre-COVID levels once that situation resolves. Hopefully soon. I'm sure everybody feels the same way about that. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Missed one here. Greg is asking, it takes longer and longer for resident hunters to obtain a tag for most species in most WMUs than ever before. Specifically, how can resident hunters influence a reduction to outfitter tag allocations?
Hi, Greg. Thanks. It's a good question. I know specific WMUs for specific species do have some long wait times in the draw system. I think pertinent to your question is how can a resident hunter influence the allocations that we provide to outfitters? I think that's one that I might refer to a previous answer I mentioned for Rod, and that's really around that 5-year allocation review. And I think from the presentation, if you can recall some of the information that Kim provided, the preponderance of harvest opportunities and allocations in Alberta are spread amongst resident hunters and to a certain extent some landowners, with the commercial hunters and outfitters only receiving, well, for sure, less than 10% of the allocated population. So I think that part of the answer to your question might not just be about how do we influence outfitter allocations, but it might be a question around how can we also look to maximize our opportunities in our draw system amongst resident hunters. And that's something that we can certainly continue to pursue. So thanks for the question, Greg. It was great.
Excellent. Thank you, Travis. So Kelly is asking, with the massive amounts of elk in Grand Prairie and the Spirit River area, there was a rumor of a call. Why is this scenario that there's not general tags on either sex and fair game for spike elk? There should be a hunter effort before a call, less waste of natural resources and of food. This has been the talk of many hunters this year. Is there any truth to the call rumor? And if it is on the table, will you commit to doing either a sex general tag first?
Thanks, Kelly, for that. I'll take that one here too. You're right. There was some I guess media in print. I believe there was an article printed in one of the local newspapers up in the Grand Prairie Spirit River area here, suggesting a cull. Fish and Wildlife Stewardship certainly shares the concern here. This was not a department-driven scenario, and so there is no truth to the fact that we are instituting a cull. I'll put it that way. I will say, however, that we've done a very good job over the last 10, 15 years here in adjusting and augmenting our regulations and allocations for antlerless elk. And it's a wonderful place to come and harvest elk. Lots of people do that, and there's lots of opportunity up here. There will still be, elk conflict in the country wherever there are elk, dependent, irrespective of what the population size is. That's just something that unfortunately elk populations are known for. But the rumor is just that, at least at this point in time. It's not a department-driven scenario, so there's nothing in place from our department to suggest otherwise.
Great, thank you, Curtis. So Don's asking, in high chronic wasting disease zones along the eastern border, where there are high numbers of antlerless mule deer tags given out through draw, is there any thought to having muzzle loader season in the last 2 weeks of October like there used to be? No additional license given, and the draw would still be required, but increased opportunities available. Also, you could have extended opportunities for this into December.
Hi, Don. Thanks for the question. So when we implemented those muzzleloader seasons at the start of our CWD program, we found that the harvest wasn't that great. Like, it wasn't greatly increased, and it wasn't helping achieve our objectives of harvesting a significant number of deer. So like you mentioned, it would be more for an opportunity standpoint, and sort of in relation to the previous question about archers in the moose rut season. If you shift a season, it's going to take away opportunity from another user group. So by having that muzzleloader season those last 2 weeks of October, it would take away from that archery only season. And it's certainly a possibility, and it is something that we are discussing. It, from an opportunity standpoint, exactly what you're saying makes sense for those muzzleloaders that want to get out and hunt in October. The discussions would have to be with our stakeholders. Is that sort of what they want in relationship to the archery season as well? You mentioned extending it into December. Currently, in those zones that you're talking about, the eastern part of Alberta, we have hunting seasons that start September, and we're going for a full 3 months. And a lot of the landowners are saying enough's enough, and we don't want any more hunting seasons. And by having people on the ground for another couple of weeks or another week, it might just be pushing those limits for landowner tolerance. So that's something to be cognizant of. And it's also come December, the rut's over, the deer have been chased around for quite a while, and their body conditions are quite low, or they can be quite low depending on the weather and the winter that we're having. And having people on the landscape for another week or two in a cold winter might not be great for deer health. So personally, I would rather see that season, a muzzleloader season in October, like you mentioned, than extending it into December. But it is something that we are having discussions about, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Rick is asking about the cougar population in Alberta that has exploded. So cougar complaints in the province have gone from less than 100 a year to over 1,200 each year. Why haven't the cougar quotas been increased?
Okay, so I don't have the conflict numbers in front of me, so I can't, I guess, confirm or deny the complaints or anything, whether they've gone from 100 to 1,200 a year. But with respect to cougar harvest, we're just completing a project where a number of cougars were collared west of Edmonton in some of our key cougar management areas to look at recruitment and look at the populations to determine what kind of sustainable harvest they could have. So as the results of that are wrapped up, that's what will drive whether there's going to be increased cougar harvest or if we're going to see cougars quotas stay the same.
Excellent, thanks, Kim. Brad is asking, if the purpose of subsistence hunting by Indigenous and Métis is to feed their families, why are antlers not forfeited to the Crown like they are in other jurisdictions to eliminate trophy hunting?
Thanks for the question, Brad. I'll take that. It's somewhat out of scope of our allocation discussion, but I think it's important to recognize that, we're not in a position to put those types of limits and parameters on how we define subsistence, and that, the rationale to hunt would, go beyond calories, right? There would be spiritual and cultural purposes, experience, kinship, tradition, getting back on the land. There's a whole lot of reasons why, an Indigenous hunter may want to keep the non-edible parts of an animal, just like you and I, although it's not the same, would also want to keep inedible parts. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. And it's nice to see you got the lights back on there. So our next question is from Rod, and Rod's asking, why are the non-resident and non-resident aliens allowed to harvest a moose, elk, mule deer, or antelope every year when I, as a resident and taxpayer, only get drawn every 4 to 12 years, depending on the species?
There we go, my mute problem. Thanks, Rod. So allocations for the outfitted hunting industry were developed or contemplated with the non-resident and non-resident alien hunters in mind in order to support Alberta's tourism industry. We didn't extend those considerations to allow outfitter allocations to be used by residents. We have had many discussions with stakeholders over the years, asking if that was a desire that to allow residents to access the outfitted hunting allocations, and all stakeholders have responded in the negative on that. There is a consideration in the Wildlife Act or in the Wildlife Reg to allow for a resident to be guided by a designated guide using their own tags, but that doesn't solve your issue about wanting an annual access to those allocations. So yeah, again, they're meant for non-resident aliens, and stakeholders did not want to extend those considerations to residents. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Mike is asking, why are draws run and released so late? 6 weeks isn't a lot of time to plan for a successful draw when some people need to put in for time off months ahead of the season. Has it been considered to do the draws earlier in the year?
I can take that one. Thanks, Robin. And thank you for the question. It's sort of a two-part one, and I'd invite one of my colleagues to jump in about when we start the draws and having to do population assessments and do aerial ungulate surveys and get the harvest data that happens through the winter when the conditions are favorable for that. But the question about the draw time from when you put in your draws to when we get the results is a good one, and I'm glad we can help clear it up because it is computerized. It is a very good system. It would be great if we could hit a button and the metrics would run while we're sleeping and we could have it in a day or two. We would all love that, I think. But there's a few steps when that draw date closes. There's a few things we do. So one is we merge accounts because often people lose their wins. So they set up 2 different accounts and we're in a constant process of merging those. So we have to make sure that people haven't gone and applied on the same draw with 2 different wins. And we have to consolidate that. Then very importantly, we need to look for exceptions. So people may inadvertently have changed things on their profile. So they could edit their age or their residency, or some people may have a suspension and be able to still apply for a draw. So we run through all those thousands and thousands of accounts. And importantly, where we emphasize client services, we'll find those exceptions and we'll actually phone you and say, we see that you changed your age or your residency. Did you actually mean to do that? Because otherwise your draw is going to be ineligible. So we make sure that you can actually draw that and have the season that you'd like to have. Once the results are there, we make sure all the recipients are eligible and that the correct amount of priority points are awarded. In other words, that if you're awarded, you have enough priority points so that we're not inadvertently making a mistake. Then we finalize that. Then we put it onto realm accounts. And that's so just triple checking to make sure that everything is right. And I know we all just look forward to our results and want to plan our vacation. So, we're constantly working on system improvement to reduce that time.
All right, thank you, Brian. So Kevin is asking, do we have estimates on the percent of animals taken through poaching each year? And do you factor these numbers into the number of licenses made available? Are you seeing an increase in the poaching numbers?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kevin. It's a good one. I'm not sure I have those numbers handy. Well, I know I don't have the numbers handy. The poaching stats would come from our colleagues in Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Service that's run through Justice and Solicitor General, as well as some of our conservation officers that are run through our Environmental Enforcement Branch. What we do in AEP is we set the areas of the province and the typical rules that we would like to emphasize enforcement on for them to conduct patrols. So we can receive those stats. I haven't got them handy and I could verify them later, but we do factor some of that information into our calculations. However, the poaching is not, I don't think it's very high in comparison to legal harvest of animals across the province, but it's a good question, and we can certainly look into our colleagues over in Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Service to help answer.
Perfect, thanks, Travis. Garrett's asking, why do the antelope and mule deer results come out on a later date than the regular draw results?
Thanks for the question. So typically our mule deer results don't come out as late as they did this year. So I'll answer the question about antelope first, then I'll come back to the mule deer question. So our antelope results come out after the rest of the big game draws because of when we do our surveys for antelope. We fly antelope surveys in the summer, where we can get a good idea on the production of young. And the rest of our surveys are done during the winter. So our surveys aren't being flown until much later, till early July, when we can get a good idea on fawn survival. And once we do our surveys for antelope, we get those numbers in and run the antelope draws. And so that's why the antelope draws are later. And it's just a question of when we do our surveys, and it is during the summer. And mule deer this year was late, and we apologize for that. And we do plan to get it back to the regular schedule where the draw results come out with the rest of the big game species. And the reason that mule deer were late this year was simply because there was some concern about our CWD program and our permit numbers that we were recommending to put out in response to CWD, and also related to some of the questions around non-residents and NRAs coming into the province to hunt with outfitter guides. So hopefully this year we'll be able to get the mule deer back to the regular schedule with the other big game species, but the antelope will continue to stay the same, and it's just a function of when we fly our surveys for them.
Great, thanks, Rob. Curtis is asking, why don't we limit Saskatchewan residents the same way as they limit us to our ability as Albertans to apply for their draw species?
Okay, so a number of different jurisdictions will have different eligibility requirements around resident and non-residents. And Alberta is fortunate to be blessed with a lot of opportunity every year, as we discussed in the webinar presentation. but also there's been a strong desire in the past by residents to be able to bring in family, friends to hunt on a hunter host license, to share that hunting experience. And Alberta brings in a lot of people that call home in a lot of different provinces. So we try to maintain that ability. However, it's, as is shown up in a couple of the questions already, as we see wait times increase, as we see more and more pressure on some of those, especially the highly sought after species, it's always something that can be open to look at again at how we allocate and the eligibility requirements to meet the requirements, because we do want to try and be meeting the objectives and desires of Albertans as well in that.
Thank you, Kim. So Brian is asking, it is time to look at opportunity for all by wildlife management unit and not by species management area for outfitters. Resident priority requirements continue to rise, and in many wildlife management units, outfitters have more opportunity than residents. If they choose to trophy hunt and take a lower harvest level than residents, then that is their choice. Many residents trophy hunt too, but they are affected by priority for all. Is this change being considered?
So, this question really sort of has been tied into a lot of the other questions about outfitter allocations, and our 5-year review. We haven't had a 5-year review for a number of years, and we're going to do that. And one of the questions that we get constantly asked is exactly this: of why do we do the species management area for outfitters versus WMU for residents? And that's a question that we haven't really settled on, I guess, is what I would say. And our current system, the way that we have been allocating in past 5-year reviews, is by the species management area. And to my knowledge, we're not planning to go away from that. But we do recognize that certainly some WMUs or the outfitter harvest has greatly exceeded the general principle of 10%. And we do need to look at ways that we can level that out. So I'm not really sure I answered your question. I apologize for that. We do know that it is an issue in some WMUs, and frankly, I'm not exactly sure how we're going to address that in the future, but it is something that we hope to work with our stakeholders in looking at. So I don't think I really did a great job answering your question, but it's a tough one.
Thanks, Rob. We appreciate your candor on that one. David is asking, do you foresee the use of ATVs or UTVs before noon impacting the number of big game harvested, as hunters are using them more and more to access areas that were only accessed previously by those on foot, to allow their use being, or for their use being allowed?
Yeah, thanks, David. Sure, this was a controversial change for sure, but I'm not sure which way it would go, to be honest with you, whether we might see increased harvest or less harvest. I think historically the reason why we didn't allow ATVs in the mornings were to preserve that quiet period in the morning for other types of hunters like myself, who really appreciated that. But the most important thing to keep in mind here is if we do see an increase, that will be represented in the hunter harvest reports on an annual basis. So allocations would be adjusted up or down based on what we see from a result of that. So I guess that remains to be seen. And maybe it could be a local issue too, in terms of where some of that harvest is coming from and whether it increases or decreases. But good question. We'll see.
Great. Thank you, Curtis. So we have a couple of questions about grizzly bears. So we're going to ask and answer those ones together here tonight. So when will we be able to hunt grizzly bears again? It seems more and more that grizzly sightings are happening in farmland east of the mountains. What have aerial surveys told us, and when will that hunt reopen? And the next part of this is Alberta has a rapidly growing grizzly bear problem. When will we use science and start to consider a grizzly bear season once again?
Okay, great questions on grizzly bear. Thanks for those. And you are right, we are hearing more and more about grizzly bears, primarily in that agriculture interface as they are spreading out from the mountains down into the producers' lands, the ranch lands. So we've got some good news on grizzly bear. We've released the 2021 Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan. That plan has updated the census numbers for a number of bear management areas across the province, including the first one we've done up in Bear Management Area 7 up in the Swan Hills. So since the inception of the plan decades ago to today, we've seen an increase in grizzly bear numbers across the province. We're now up to, I think the estimates at the top end are up to around 973 adults, which is very promising for that species. So what I can say is the recovery plan's working. Now, with the increase in bears comes the increase in conflicts, human-wildlife encounters. Some of those can be negative. So before us as a department go any further, what we do is we look at the statusing of that species, given the new information that's become available. And I can say right at this moment, our group in Fish and Wildlife Stewardship branch is actually restatusing the grizzly bear. We're looking at the population increases. We're looking at the recovery plan goals and what that might mean. So we're using science. That's part of the question. We're infusing science. Plus, we're also hearing a lot from our ranchers and producers and just recreationalists, that enjoy grizzly bears. So to answer the question about when are we going to hunt grizzly bears again in Alberta, I don't have an answer today for that. What I can tell you though is that we're restatusing that population. We're going to be coming out with the new status in the new year, in hopefully in 2022, and then we can have a discussion about potential management tools based on the results from that statusing. So thanks for the question. It's a good one and a timely one. Appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much, Travis. Our next question is from Scott. What % success is estimated for archery take? There are lots of general tags available to archery hunters. Just wondering how many are successful each fall and if long archery seasons have any effect on harvest numbers.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for the question. So it's you sort of ask a number of questions there, and I'll try to answer them each. So what % success is estimated for archery take? Well, that varies by species and by WMU. So it varies, across the province and by species. And that information is gathered by our annual game harvest survey, both the mandatory survey for special licenses and the voluntary survey for general licenses. So that's how we estimate our success for the archery take. And your second part of the question is there's lots of general tags available to archery hunters. Just wondering how many are successful each fall, and if the long archery seasons have an effect on harvest numbers. So again, how many are successful? Again, it varies by WMU and by species. For some species, for example, moose during the rut, archers can be very successful. And again, it varies depending on where and what species. And you ask if the long archery seasons can have an effect on harvest numbers. For sure. The longer the season is, the more likelihood that someone will be able to harvest an animal. We take that into account when we set our allocations, and it's also really used when we determine if archery seasons are going to require a special license. A number of years ago, we moved a bunch of WMUs for antlered mule deer to require a special license because we were finding that the archery harvest was very successful and taking a lot of deer during that season. So we moved them from a general season to a special license season, and we've done that with mule deer, with moose, and with elk. So we do monitor that, and that harvest is based on our game harvest survey.
Great, thank you for that answer, Rob. Our next question is from Shane. Who are the top 5 stakeholders that Environment and Parks refers to?
Thanks, Shane. I'm not quite sure if I'm reading your question right. Are you not sure if you're asking who we're referencing or referring to when we say stakeholders, or who our top 5 are that we typically go to. And I don't know that we have a top 5, but what I'll try and do is provide a bit of context on the stakeholders that we have. So hunting has a lot of moving components to it, in a sense that it's on land that's both public and privately owned. As I mentioned in our priorities and the principles for allocation, we're looking for conservation first. And we have a lot of different hunting groups that are interested in want to have a voice in how we manage our big game species. So we have different stakeholder groups. For hunting groups, there's quite a few. There's the Alberta Professional Outfitters Society, Alberta Fish and Game, Alberta Bow Hunters, Backcountry Hunter and Anglers, Sierra Club, Wild Sheep Federation, and Boone and Crockett clubs, just to name a few. We have different landowner stakeholder groups that we're often involving when we're engaging on different things, such as Alberta beef producers, the rural municipalities. There's leaseholder associations and other landowner groups across the province. From a conservation perspective, we have the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, the ACA, Nature Conservancy of Canada, among others. We have academia stakeholder groups that we regularly involve in things, people from the U of A, U of C, U of L. So I wouldn't say that there's always necessarily a go-to top 5 or top any number. Typically, we do try, when we're going broader consultation, involve a variety, a cross-section of those user groups. Some of those groups are larger than others, but some of the more larger groups that people are more, I guess, familiar with and that are typically always involved or engaged would be some like APOS, AFGA, Alberta Beef Producers, Alberta Bow Hunters, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, ACA, NCC, and academia. So I don't know if I completely answered it. We don't have a top 5 that we always go to on everything, and we don't weight necessarily any input by one more so over than another. We try and get input onto decisions when we're setting management objectives without having too big a group or an unwieldy group, but still trying to capture a cross section of Albertans and how we can get the best representation. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for that info, Kim. Our next question is from Josh. Is it true harvesters can hunt at night? If so, how did that evolve to a right utilizing today's technology?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, that's a difficult question for us to answer here tonight. And to be honest, I would defer that to our colleagues in Justice and Solicitor General in understanding how they may or may not apply Alberta's Wildlife Act and associated regs and whatever federal legislation to that. But thanks for the question.
Great, thanks, Brian. So our next question's from Brian, different Brian. Even prior to COVID outfitter allocations for moose, in some WMUs exceeded resident allocations. For example, in WMU 350, when population estimations dropped from 2017 to 2019, resident allocations dropped to 32, 24, and 24, while some outfitter allocations remained at 36. I realize the outfitters need stability to some extent for allocations, but when there's no concern for population levels, why are management controls not distributed across all allocations?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so I mean, again, we're looking at, we recognize there are some WMUs where outfitter allocations are out of balance, and we look to the review period to do that. And we set these allocations for a 5-year term so outfitters can business plan. And unfortunately, we extended the last 5-year review, and so there's been a lot of water under the bridge between 5-year reviews, and we just need to look forward to the next review where we can try to bring some of those back into balance. So just a combination of factors that has led to where we are now, and but we are committed to working with our stakeholders and the outfitting industry to try to get some of those ones back into balance. Thank you, though.
Thanks, Dave. Our next question is from another Dave. How much of the recreation allocation has been reduced due to the recent addition of the Métis harvest license?
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the question, Dave. Maybe I'll just jump in there. I think one of our panel members may have lost connection to his internet. I think at the building it's been going in and out. Our apologies for that. Good question. We haven't altered any resident allocations based on the Métis harvesting policy and the harvesters that are out there right now. What we are doing is we continue to work with the two larger Métis organizations, one being the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Métis Settlements General Council being the other, and coordinating with them on their harvesting committees so that we can try and evaluate how it's going with the policy, and not only that, but get a sense of what the harvest levels might be and if those harvest levels are changing. But it hasn't affected the allocations that we provide to resident hunters, and it hasn't affected the allocation to commercial hunters either. And if you think back to the presentation in the PowerPoint, there was a big chunk of the pie that was going to conservation, Indigenous Harvest, and treaty rights holders. And so from that perspective, we do try to make sure that we're dealing with those without impacting the resident harvests. So thanks for the question. I hope I answered it. It was a good one.
Great, and thanks for stepping in there, Travis. Our next question is from Rod. Are landowner tags actually capped per WMU?
So in some WMUs for antlerless elk, there are actual caps in place. However, those caps have never been reached. So to answer your question, Rod, there are caps in place. However, they haven't been reached. For mule deer and most WMUs for antlerless elk, there are no caps.
Thanks, Rob. Travis is asking, is Alberta going to look at creating a residency verification system? Saskatchewan has their residency verification system linked with their healthcare system. And if you do not hold a valid health card number, you cannot purchase resident tags.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I can take a crack at that one. So these questions of residency come up quite frequently, and it's certainly of interest to a lot of Alberta's resident hunters. And these are the types of questions that we can consider and that we can engage on as well. So we have a number of working ideas on how to change that or improve that, as it were, and certainly something we can work on through 2022 with our wildlife regulations.
Thanks, Brian. Curtis asks, do outfitters have to report their success, and how can I access this information?
Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, outfitters do have to submit mandatory activity reports on an annual basis, and that information is used to help develop the permit tables, are used to allocate the big game. The specific activity reports are not available publicly because of FOIPA issues, but we do summarize that information and are able to access that on My Wild Alberta through the big game reports that are on those on that site.
Thank you, Dave. Jesse asked, what would the approximate timeline from the engagement of a study to the shift in allocation of hunter opportunity be? For example, the cougar program you have started near Edmonton.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. Well, it's going to depend on the species and what the program is. But as they wrap up all the data collection in that program and then start to evaluate the population and develop the population estimates for that, they should be able to implement those changes fairly soon. So as they finish up on the analysis of that, we could see any changes to the cougar quotas, perhaps for next hunting season, or if not, the following season.
Thanks, Kim. Kelly asked, why do I need to buy a wildlife certificate, general tag, bow hunting permit, etc.? Is there no possible way to consolidate these items through a much simpler system? Most hunters perceive this as a cash grab, especially when you add discharge permits on top of this.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, that's a good question. And as I was saying earlier, we're always looking for efficiencies and system improvements, but specifically those three that you mentioned. So the wildlife certificate is kind of the entry permit to buying other licenses, and is indeed a source of revenue for sure. It's also the way we count hunters. So that's kind of the number of wildlife certificates gives us an idea of how many people have signaled an intent to hunt in Alberta. The general tag, general tags being the over-the-counter tags for various species as opposed to special licenses. So that's just a suite of licenses that you can pick to hunt species, sex, age class, or by WMU. So that's why you would need one of those specific licenses depending on what and where and when you're hunting in those various seasons. What was the other one? A bow hunting permit. So the genesis of the bow hunting permit really was as a means to assess bow hunter participation. And if we know how many active bow hunters there are, then we know how to allocate a harvest that reflects that proportion of hunters. That's why we have a bow hunting permit. And the firearms discharge permits, I'm not too sure. You could mean the ones issued by Alberta Parks. Those are free of charge. Or something like the disability permit that we issue for eligible people, which is also free of charge. So I'm not sure if there was a different discharge permit in there, but thanks for the question.
Great, thank you, Brian. Ross is asking why some of the draw tags are unsustainable, for example, the bighorn sheep. So will the priority system change because of this?
That's a really great question, Ross. And I've been in my role or some type of my role for almost 15 years now. And I would say that question is probably one of the most asked questions that I've received in my career with Fish and Wildlife. And it's a tough question. Like some of those sheep draws that you're referencing, if you were to apply now, you wouldn't get drawn for over 400 years. And I don't know of many sheep hunters that are going to be hunting sheep or climbing a mountain in 400 years. So something I think needs to be done for some of those draw codes that are statistically unachievable for new hunters. And it's really tough because those people that have been putting in for them since the beginning, and of course they don't want to allow other people that opportunity to get access to the chance to get a draw. It's a real tough situation to address, and frankly I don't know how we're going to do it. It is something that in our stakeholder survey or our public survey that we just ran in feedback, it was one of the most asked questions that we got. And to be honest, I don't know how we're going to address it. And it really comes down to what our stakeholders want. And we can allocate 5 tags for a sheep zone, but how do we distribute those tags is the tricky part. And for every idea that I can think of where we could change it, there's somebody that thinks it's a terrible idea. And so we are committed to engaging our stakeholders to look at some of those high priority draws. And I'm not just saying that as like government speak. It is something that we do want to address. And if you have any good ideas, or if anybody does have a good idea, please feel free to email me. I would love to hear them, and I'd love to talk to any one of you out there that has an idea how we can address that, because it is an issue. But sorry, I don't have an answer.
Thanks, Rob. And time flies. That brings us to our last question of the evening from Franz. Can you explain in more detail the relative sizes of the pie slices of the pie chart on the slide titled "Big Game are a Shared Resource"? Conservation and Indigenous harvest rights take up a big chunk. And since I assume conservation has a harvest number of 0, is this whole chunk Indigenous harvest?
Okay, thanks, Franz. And I'll provide a little bit of a clarification on that. Then when we were presenting the pie chart actually represents the entire provincial population, not the population that's allocated out for harvest. So the majority, 80% plus of any population is there to make sure that the population remains sustainable and to support the Indigenous harvest rates. The allocation, the smaller slice of the pie, in the pie chart, I think it would have looked like about 15 to 20% of it. That's the part that we were focused on tonight. And it's the part, the harvestable surplus of a population that can be harvested through recreational commercial hunting. So the slice that we talked about is what's allocated for harvest that we actually allocate. The whole pie chart represents the entire population, not just the part that's allocated for harvest. So I hope that provides the clarification you were looking for.
Thank you, Kim. Excellent. And thank you everyone for participating in tonight's session. We really appreciate all of the great questions that have been coming in. So the goal for our panelists tonight was really to start this conversation about hunting and wildlife management in Alberta. And so we'll take the questions that we received tonight and review them for consideration in future work. So tonight, when you leave this webinar, you'll also be directed to a survey so that you can provide feedback on how this evening session went from your perspective. But really, we're hoping to build off the momentum that we've started here tonight and keep this dialogue going. So if any of your questions didn't get answered this evening, or if you'd like to follow up on some of the things you've learned here, you can connect with us and all of these panelists by email using that email up on your screen right now. And it's the same email that sent out tonight's webinar details, so you can also find it in there after the session. We are here to chat and share some information. So on that note too, I know we mentioned it before, but we do have a second education webinar coming up next Tuesday night, same time, 7 to 8:30 on December 14th. And next week is an opportunity to learn more about the science behind your hunting license and continue to ask some great questions about how hunting opportunities in Alberta are determined each year. So in your chat right now, you'll see that we've shared a link to register for that if you haven't already signed up. And now there are a couple of other ways that you can keep in touch with us. So the My Wild Alberta Facebook page is another great resource and a tool that Environment and Parks uses to share hunting information, as well as information about angling and trapping. So if you don't follow us on Facebook, we'd like to invite you to do so to get an insider look at what some of our Fish and Wildlife Stewardship staff are up to and learn more about ongoing projects across the province. We also invite you to send us a direct message there if you have questions. That's another way to get in touch with our panelists tonight. You can also find information about wildlife management and hunting in the province online. It is housed across 3 different sites. So some of it's on alberta.ca, some more of it's on albertarealm.com, which is where you actually go for information about hunting seasons and to purchase your licenses. And last but not least is mywildalberta.ca, where we do also share those allocation reports each year. So you can find any of those through a quick Google search. And we also rely on hunter reports of suspicious or illegal hunting activity or dangerous wildlife encounters to report a poacher. So reporting these incidents really helps us to be able to ensure that everyone has a safe and enjoyable experience out there, whether they're hunting or using the land through other activities. So again, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us tonight. And we look forward to connecting more with you in the future. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your